Thank you, Tom, and good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Ostrolenk. I'm co-founder and national director of the Liberty Coalition. And midterm of first Bush administration, I was introduced to Rick Plum, who was working on whistleblower issues. And at the time, he introduced me to a lady named Isabel Edmonds, who was an FBI whistleblower. And through that introduction, I got introduced to the whistleblower issue. I got introduced to a whole bunch of whistleblowers and the whistleblower community, including GAP and POGO, ACLU, and all the other groups who are working to protect whistleblowers. And I was approached as a conservative, and they thought I could be helpful on the right in interesting the right to work on protecting whistleblowers, especially in the national security realm. I thought, well, this should be pretty easy. Why? Well, because the national security conservatives should naturally want to favor whistleblower protections so they can make sure that we are protected from foreign and domestic threats. And I thought fiscal conservatives should naturally be inclined to protect national security and other whistleblowers because they would not want to see our taxpayer dollars wasted. And I thought constitutionalists, those who want to see separation of powers and protections of individual liberties, should naturally be inclined to protect whistleblowers because they wouldn't want to see our rights undermined. And unfortunately, I was not correct in my assumptions about the natural inclinations of people on my side of the political spectrum to support whistleblowers. Not to say there aren't people on the right, conservatives, libertarians, and constitutionalists who do, but for the most part in the Bush administration is a very uphill battle. And it's unfortunate and mostly due to partisan interests. And now that President Obama and the Democrats are in control, it seems there might be a switch and a little bit easier to encourage folks on the center right, especially the politicians, to support whistleblower protections. And it's useful to our global efforts, but it's really a shame, because if it's right, it's right. It shouldn't matter if it's Democrats or Republicans or liberal or conservatives. We should all work together to protect whistleblowers. I'm glad to be here with my friends on the right. The title of this conversation is Being Right on Whistleblowing, a Conservative Analysis. And to my left, but not necessarily to my left, is Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaffer, a highly experienced intelligence officer and recipient of the Bronze Star with 25 years of field experience. Tony has commanded and directed several key operations, intelligence organizations. He became a senior intelligence officer and created Task Force Stratus Ivy that conducted the full spectrum support to Department of Defense, Special Operations Command, and other non-DoD agencies. This includes support to the controversial counterterrorism program known as Able Danger, a pre-9/11 offensive operations suit designed to detect, degrade, and counter al-Qaeda capabilities. In 2001, just after the 9/11 attacks, he was returned to active duty for a 30-month period, during which he commanded a DI operating base, OB Alpha, and had 2 successful combat tours in Afghanistan. He has also authored this book, Operation Dark Heart, which I recommend to you. Also have perhaps a new friend, Pete Forcelli. He's a supervisory special agent with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives outside of Phoenix, Arizona. He began his career in law enforcement at the New York Police Department. He worked in Bronx County, often referred to as Bronx, as a uniformed police officer, and then ultimately as a detective in the Bronx Homicide Task Force. Mr. Forcelli is a key whistleblower in the disclosure that exposed Operation Fast and Furious, the DOG operation that funneled some 2,000 firearms to Mexican drug cartels as a field infiltration technique. Also have Pete Sepp, directly to my right. He's Executive VP of the National Taxpayers Union, serves as Deputy to NTU's President Dwayne Pardee. He has written, edited numerous policy papers, informational publications, and activist manuals. He's testified before Congress on matters ranging from government-sponsored enterprises and lending to Medicare reforms, and has lectured in the U.S. and abroad. He has appeared on every major television network, including CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. And David Williams, he's the president of the Taxpayer Protection Alliance. In his 18 years in Washington, D.C., David has become an expert in finding and exposing government waste and helped fine-tune criteria in identifying and ultimately eliminating earmarks. He has appeared on multiple television and radio shows, including ABC World News Tonight. And what we're going to do is, first I'm going to turn it over to my friend Tony Schaffer, Lieutenant Colonel Schaffer, And he's just going to walk you through very briefly his experiences of being a whistleblower. Then I'll turn it over to Mr. Forcelli to do the same. And then we'll open up to a conversation among my conservative activist friends. Two things being addressed. Why it's been difficult to open the write-up to this issue, although it seems quite natural, and what we need to do collectively to move these issues forward. Tony Schaffer.
Thank you for having me today, and I'm going to start off by stating clearly this is not a left or right issue. As a matter of fact, I see a good friend, Mike Truman from ACLU, here in the audience. I think we have to recognize that there are good people on both sides, period. And this is something that we cannot afford by any measure of the imagination to become politicized, and yet we've seen that. We've seen that in the opening comments and everything else. One of the sore points that I've had, and some of you have already experienced this from being in this town, and it was something that shocked me when I first learned this back in 2005. In Washington, the truth is negotiable. Think about it. It is. The truth is not the truth when it enters the Beltway, and that's something we've got to change. We all have, who are in government service, take an oath of office. And that should be the cornerstone for every government official's actions. There's no loopholes there for being loyal to guys who want to break the law because it's going to benefit you. There's not. I've looked at the oath of office and I've yet to see any little loophole for that that makes it permissible. Yet we accept it all the time. Congress has taken no direct, aggressive role in fixing this. Why? And as a conservative, you know, I fundamentally look at things from the bottom line. What is the cost benefit? One of the greatest journals I ever worked for, Bob Scanlon, Major General Scanlon, said, what is the value added? Are we doing something to help the country in what we're doing? And I was only a captain at the time. I was like, man, that's brilliant. But I didn't understand at the time that that was an exception to the rule, that he was thinking exceptionally to what others like him were thinking. Back when as Michael alluded to, I ran total about 25 years of undercover operations. Recently, I retired this past week. Representative Walter Jones hosted my retirement in his office after 30.5 years serving. My tribute, the tribute he put in to me is online if you want to look at it. It's a good summary of my career. I did a lot of stuff, and I like to believe it had benefited the country. And the reason I'm referencing this is because I had two fundamental rules which govern my actions. I had two ethical rules that I always used. First, when I'm given an operation, something to do, I would always use this test. The first test is the 60 minutes rule, the Ed Bradley rule. What if Ed Bradley, and I met Ed Bradley, God rest his soul, before he died, he's a good guy. What if Ed Bradley showed up on my doorstep to do an ambush interview? Could I tell the truth, lay out what I'm doing, and still come out looking good? Not trying to look good, just tell the truth, and would it make sense to the American public? Is it ethical? Secondly, I call this and please don't take this as a pejorative, the Joe Sixpack rule. Would Joe Sixpack, would some guy in Minot, North Dakota, who is spending money, barely feeding his family, would he see the benefit, the cost benefit of this operation? Would he be willing to take $5 and give it to me to do something? Would he do it? Would he think? Would he, at the fundamental level of trying to understand what's best for him and his family, would he understand what I'm doing to benefit him? Two very simple ethical rules. I think anybody should have that amount of wherewithal to say, is this in the benefit to the American people? Would someone actually want this to be paid for? Really? So those are the two things I always judged my activities by. And if they met those criteria, I would go into it both feet. And we did a lot of good stuff. And that's one of the ironies of being an intelligence officer. You can never talk about the best stuff you did. You can only talk about the stuff that didn't go well, where you can get corrected. So we move forward to Able Danger. Boy, Able Danger was, again, a game changer for me by the fact that I never sought to be a whistleblower. To this day, I just don't see myself as a whistleblower. I just see myself as a guy trying to do the right thing. The reason I ended up on Capitol Hill as an undercover guy is because I was attached to something called Deep Blue. It was the U.S. Navy's think tank looking at terrorism issues in 2005. And they sent me over to the Hill to ask for money. Imagine that. An Army guy going to the Hill to ask for Navy for money. And that's how it started. And I got some hard questions about, hey, this is a good idea, that what the Navy wants to do, but what happened to the previous program? And that opened a can of worms, which resulted in all sorts of wailing and gnashing of teeth, which still goes on to this day. And fundamentally, one of the things that's notable in the able danger thing is that it was never about what the government made it out to be. It's never about a photograph of Muhammad Atta. That's what they reduced it to. This is what the government will do to try to obfuscate the bigger picture. Well, we never found a picture of Muhammad Atta. Well, no, you probably didn't, because his name was Syed in the database, and he was in a different set of pictures as well. We didn't have his Florida driver's license picture because at the time we were doing this, it didn't exist. It was a MacGuffin, to use a movie term. So the bottom line was, and this is what we testified to, and everybody understands basically, we found the existence of Al-Qaeda cells operating within the United States in the 1999 timeframe. Here, United States. We found that. And more importantly, we had the capability to do something about it, and because of any number of reasons, the Jamie Gorelick memo and other things, we were never permitted to share the information with the FBI. And there's other things that can go into it. But with that said, to this day, all these years later, I have never been permitted to testify about what my real role was in able danger. Think about it. And it has to do with technology. Though we don't want to talk about that. I was actually in closed hearings at top secret level and waved off by the staff director of the House Armed Services Committee. Don't talk about that. Okay, so much for oversight. So there's only a desire to go so far in this town, from my experience, to get to the truth. And the truth then becomes negotiable and part of a political equation. So let's go to talk about my story just for a brief second, what they got me on. They were able to finally figure out a way to take me down and revoke my clearance over 3 issues. Now, keep in mind, one of the things I want you all to think about is how much time and effort the government spends investigating someone over nothing. They spent probably about $1 million, if you add up all the man hours, staff time, resources that went into an investigation to try to get me on something when I was in command of an operating base. For those of you in the military, when you're in command of something, and I was in command of an operating base which did global operations, I had people all over the freaking world. There's always something that's going to go wrong. They went through and did a year review of everything I did as the commander. And the only 3 things they could come up with are this. First, the illegal use of a government cell phone to the tune of $67.67. $67. And they got that by figuring out that I was taking my phone and forwarding it on weekends and holidays, my government phone and my personal phone. It resulted in a 35-cent charge over 18 months. Think about that. Think about the investigative time it took to figure that out. $76. Second issue, illegal filing of a voucher. Now, I had to go to Fort Dix, New Jersey to be promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, so God forbid, I put a voucher in for the mileage. It wasn't a false voucher. They said, well, okay, it wasn't false. You used the wrong document. That's illegal? And oh, by the way, the amount I filed for, $120. And tolls, probably another $60 for tolls. And the third issue you're going to laugh at was the undue award of the Defense Meritorious Service Medal. I got a medal, wow. And it was undue because, well, somehow you convinced the general to approve it for you. Really? I never met the general. Well, somehow you did it. You must be a Jedi Knight or something, a Jedi mind trick. And I've been accused, by the way, in an investigation of using Jedi mind tricks on people, believe it or not. So, that's it. Those are the 3 allegations they used to revoke my time after working for 25 years in the field. Now just think about, if nothing else, think about the expense it cost to train me to be a case officer. Think about it. So again, you know, my record of service is public record, so you can go and check it out for yourself. So just think about it from the citizen's perspective. Gee, is this really a good return on my investment in this guy being an intelligence officer? Think about it. Geez, you know, and case officer training, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is about as expensive as military pilot training, because they send you to a place that we can't talk about, known as the farm, and they send you through a lot of stuff. We can't talk about where it's at. So anyway, so that goes to my next point. I wrote a book, Operation Dark Heart. It was a bestseller last year. Made it to #7 on the New York Times bestseller list because of, well, because people didn't like it. Imagine that. I wrote this with full approval of my Army chain of command, and I did everything they told me, every step of the way. And yet somehow, when it came time to be close to being published, Defense Intelligence Agency got a copy of it, which, by the way, just so you all know, I'd offered up to them a full 6 months before they got a copy. So this all became very dramatic. And to make a long story very short, when the book publisher was ready to go, it was in the warehouse, ready to go out, and I get called in by my commanding general in the Army, and she shows me this memo. It says that we Army have to withdraw your approval to print the book. Okay, why? Well, Defense Intelligence Agency claims there's top secret information in it. Really? Well, that's kind of hard to believe since we've been through the vetting process, but okay. She hands me this memo, which, if you've written a book, you always know there's certain things that's great for publicity. Well, one of the best things for an intelligence book is to tell people there's classified information. Don't read it, there's classified information. So I get this memo, and it's signed by the director of DI saying, if this book is published, the free world will fall. Really? I mean, that's what I'm just paraphrasing here. I didn't really say that, but you know, it's kind of said that. Anyway, so I get this, and it's like, oh my God, this is gold. This is wonderful. And I have this ethical moment. It's like, what do I do? What do I do? Man, do I take this and run and say, thank you, ma'am, or do I do the right thing? Well, since I've tried to behave ethically most of my life, believe it or not, despite the reports about my being a cowboy, I sit back and I look at it and I give it back to the general and said, you don't want to do this. This is not good. This is going to have the opposite effect. And she said, what do you mean? It's like, look, I'm a media guy now. I'm in the media, you know, I do a lot of policy stuff. This will have the opposite effect. And I slide it back to my boss, who's a lawyer, and he looks at it and he says, oh my God, this will spin it into the ceiling. It's like, yeah, exactly. If this is really, and I swear to God, this is what I said. I said, if DIA really does believe there's classified information in this, we have to get it off the radar. We can't talk about it. I said, I'm willing to go to the Pentagon and sit down and go through it with them. I really am. And if they really want to go through and try to get anything they think is classified out, I would do it. But don't do it publicly. This memo will have the opposite effect. Once you give it to me, I give it to the publisher, it'll be in the New York Times within days. And so she takes it and looks at it and it's like, oh my God, you're probably right. So they go back and they vacillate for 2 days. And I get a call from the lawyer who cleared the book originally and said, Tony, they're sending you the memo. Okay. And sure enough, my friend Scott Shane from the New York Times calls me about 10 days later. Tony, how you doing? Doing good, Scott. What's up with your book? I can't talk about it. Really? Why? Well, and that's where it all started. Next thing you know, the drama that you all saw unfold about the book. It didn't have to happen. They chose it. Mark Zaid, my good friend, I don't know if he's here today, Mark told us, like, hey, you don't want to do this. Ixnay on redaction, you know, don't want to do it. They did it anyway. It was, and I believe now, it was meant to send me a message. You can't walk away. We're going to get you. Okay. Well, okay, here we go. So that is what made it a bestseller. And it's like, I was on CNN and they interviewed me. It's like, well, how do you feel about this with DI? It's like, I want to give them flowers. This is wonderful. It's like, I couldn't get better publicity. I mean, I don't know, you all probably saw, there's a number of, redactions. By the way, if you take vinegar and put it on there, it'll develop them. That's a joke. I won't do that. It'll ruin it. So that's my point. We've got to look at this as what's best for the country, not what's best for individuals. I think fundamentally, each of us who take the oath of office have to take it seriously. Congress should hold people accountable. All too often what we see is people in government trying to hide mistakes and failures by putting it into the classified realm. Would Kinley, president of Enron, would he have used a classification system to hide his wrongdoing if he could have? Of course he could. Of course he would have. Do we really think that there are people like Kinley, somehow Kinley-type people don't end up in government? Of course they do. it is those folks we have to focus on and keep out. There's no reason to go after good Americans trying to do the right thing. So fundamentally, this is a conservative issue, but it's a liberal issue too. It's about doing the right thing for the right reasons. We all can agree that we all want to save money, right? Okay. We need to take the tools of folks away, the government away, to investigate people. Oh, by the way, as I retired this last week, I went out still under investigation. Isn't that wonderful? And because the government was upset about Dark Heart, they were investigating. One more time, they were investigating me. Well, somehow you were able to get people to approve your book. Yeah, I put it through the system. Well, we still didn't like what you had to say. Okay, well, that's too bad. I have the First Amendment right. So to what they did, because they didn't like it and they couldn't find anything I did wrong, they put on orders, a 2-star general, Jeffrey Arnold. I'll give his name out, Jeffrey Arnold. And he was his own. You might think if you're going to do an investigation of intelligence issues, you'd hire a 2-star general with intelligence background, special operations background, who understands all the mechanisms, so you know not what to talk about. Well, it's pretty clear that that was not the desire here, because they hire a guy who in real life is a divorce attorney from Atlanta. And when I go to my boss to complain about the nature of what they're asking questions about, it's like, well, Tony, don't you understand? This is not about the truth. They're out to get you. That's what, they're not even trying to hide it now. So they actually hire a 2-star general, divorce attorney, to try to get me on something. And they spend another year investigating me. Again, taxpayer dollars at work. Isn't that wonderful? Think about that. Endless investigations. So that's my bottom line here today. We've got to think about what's best for the country and depoliticize this whole whistleblowing thing. Again, the only reason I'm a whistleblower is because Denny Hastert personally asked me to do it. Think about that. And I still got no protection. There was no protections for me. None. Zero. And just the undying hatred of certain folks in DOD. So that's all I'll say today is that, think about this from a what's the best for the country perspective. And you all have to advocate with us, for us, to do the right thing, because some of us are just too stupid to get the message that maybe what you're doing is not helpful. Well, it is helpful, because we have the obligation to our oath of office. And if we fail to do that, then our republic is going to perish. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Good morning.
After 3 such eloquent speakers, interesting to have a guy with such a thick Bronx accent speaking in front of you. So if anybody needs any translation, please let me know. I've been in law enforcement for 25 years. I took the oath to the U.S. Constitution when I became a New York City police officer. Took it again when I was promoted to detective, and then the 3rd time when I was sworn in as an agent with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. The oath to the Constitution is an oath to the American people, and I take it very seriously. In my 25 years in law enforcement, I've had the misfortune of being shot, of having to use deadly force, of having been sued 11 times, and of having been present at the World Trade Center attacks on September 11th, 2001. And as a result of my duties there, I actually have an incurable illness, which I won't get into the specifics of, but I've paid my dues, is what I'm trying to say. None of those things that I've been involved in prepared me for what I was about to embark upon by becoming a whistleblower. The isolation, the fear of losing your job, the retaliatory remarks, the attempts to defame your character. Completely unexpected, and all I did was what I thought was the right thing. So I'll discuss a little bit about why I became a whistleblower in the first place. I imagine some of you have heard of recently Operation Fast and Furious, which was an ATF investigation run out of Phoenix, Arizona. I was not directly involved in Operation Fast and Furious in any way. I just happened to be employed in the city of Phoenix where that investigation was based out of. And I attended several meetings where I heard agents that I work with discussing an investigation that they were working on, where they had initially, when I first heard about these discussions, they had uncovered a cell trafficking firearms to the Mexican drug cartels, who had trafficked approximately 1,200 weapons. They call them weapons of choice. And when I say weapons of choice, the cartels look for specific weapons, unlike the drug dealers in New York, Detroit, Washington, inner city United States. They look for your AK-47 variant, your AR-15, basically civilian versions of assault weapons. So I found out that this group had purchased 1,200, and I was actually surprised. It's quite a high number of firearms, and my belief at the time was that our agents, in doing their due diligence, had uncovered, by looking at documents, individuals who bought these weapons. Never in a million years would I have dreamed that while these transactions were taking place, our agents were out there watching. They were watching these weapons be purchased, watching them be loaded into cars, and watching them drive off into the sunset without ever taking any steps to do an interdiction, which is what I've done my entire career as a police officer. That's what we do. Our job is to protect the public. As I go to additional meetings, the numbers would go up. 1,800 firearms, 2,000 firearms. Finally, in January of 2011, we had what we call a takedown. We had a briefing where we were getting ready, and I was actually present for the briefing, to go out and arrest the individuals who were involved in the trafficking of these firearms. And the case agent began to show a PowerPoint presentation. And amongst the still photos in the PowerPoint presentations were photos that were taken from video surveillance inside of the gun shops, which means that our agents, again, watched these cartel associates take possession of firearms that they knew were going to be driven down to Mexico. Now, when you consider that in the government of Mexico, there's institutional corruption, but there are also people who are in law enforcement and in the military there who are working to do the right thing under unbelievable odds, not knowing whether the bullet that they're going to get shot from is going to come from the front or from one of their colleagues behind them. And I have had the opportunity to go down to Mexico and deal with my colleagues down there on a number of occasions, and I gained a tremendous amount of respect for the ones who have not succumbed to corruption. Anyway, as the case began to unravel, I had reached out to people from Senator Grassley and Congressman Ice's committees to report what I believe to be some very egregious conduct on the part of some of my colleagues. And again, conduct that clearly endangered the public in Mexico, and frankly in the United States, because the surveillances on these firearms purchases were terminated in the United States, which means that the case agent and those working on the case believed that the guns were going to the cartels in Mexico, but as we all know, Mexican cartel drugs are sold all over the United States, so nothing says that some of these rifles could not have been diverted to Detroit, here, Washington, D.C., New York, or elsewhere. Again, just a grave public safety concern, in my opinion, on both sides of the border. As I learned more and more about the investigation, I had found out that a lot of the decisions to allow these firearms to be allowed to, what we call walk, basically go uninterdicted, were done at the request of the assigned prosecutor and assistant United States attorney. In fact, if you pay attention to the media, when Fast and Furious first broke, it was an ATF scandal. The fact is, it goes far beyond that. It's not just an ATF scandal. It's a scandal that affects several agents in the Phoenix Field Division, but also the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Arizona, and anybody in ATF headquarters or in the Department of Justice that was aware of this. This was something that they had a duty to stop. Another thing that recently surfaced, and this is something that I was more involved with, is we had also identified an individual who was trafficking in hand grenade parts into Mexico. Not grenades, but disassembled hand grenades. Our belief was that he was probably taking these items into Mexico, reconstructing them, and turning them into improvised explosive devices. We had gone out and interviewed many people who had known this individual and built up that probable cause that we believe that that's exactly what he was doing. And at one point in June of last year, June of 2010, he was stopped crossing the San Luis port of entry with 114 disassembled hand grenades in his tire. No explosive. Had he had an explosive, we would have been able to charge that here in the United States. The only charge that we could have brought forward with him exporting these disassembled grenades would have been violations of the Arms Export Control Act. The assigned prosecutor told us he wouldn't prosecute it. We begged for permission to keep this individual in custody. What graver concern is there to the safety of the public that a person is making improvised explosive devices, especially post 9/11? To this day, that individual is not indicted in the United States. What we were forced to do was to network with our associates within the government of Mexico and help them build a case down there. On August 31st of this year, just weeks ago, the Mexican government executed search warrants based on our information, coupled with information that they had gathered, and found out that that person, who we had in custody over a year ago, had enough materials in his possession to make between 900 and 1,000 hand grenades. There have been 40,000 people murdered in Mexico in recent years because of the war on drugs. I know a lot of them will turn around, well, people within the government of Mexico like to turn around and say it's because of American demand, and I won't argue with that. But I can certainly say that many American firearms are being illegally smuggled into Mexico to supplement the war that the cartels are fighting with each other, with the military, and with their local officials. And that is, of course, that supplements the firearms that they're able to get from Central America, South America. The individual that we arrested who was making these grenades also confessed to us that he had taught the cartels how to take the semi-automatic rifles that are purchased here legally and turn them into machine guns down in Mexico. So, for my efforts for coming forward and explaining what I had observed to members of Congressman Issa's staff and Senator Grassley's staff, I was put on a panel and testified before the committee on June 15th. And since then, I've had the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Arizona begin a campaign. The campaign started with accusations of perjury, because there was no way that what I was saying in front of the committee could have been true, despite the fact that I had witnesses and other documents that corroborated. When that didn't work out for them, they began other matters of documenting my behavior. Some of them included their referencing my conduct at meetings with them regarding the grenade case and other cases that had occurred months earlier. So if my conduct was so offensive to someone, you figured they would document it the day of the meeting. Instead, I would see memos summarizing my conduct at meetings that had occurred 3-4 months before the memo was prepared. In federal law enforcement, the accusation of being less than candid, being the liar, is grounds for termination. Because the belief is, if you can't take the witness stand effectively, if you're not a truthful person, you're of no use to them as a special agent. The other thing, as these gentlemen pointed out, is the accusation could also result in the revocation of my security clearance. Although in 5 years when I'm due for my renewal, whether or not that'll happen. All I did was what I felt my duty was to do, to protect the people. Allowing firearms in the hands of legitimate citizens are not a concern to ATF special agents. Firearms in the hands of criminals are very concerning. Firearms in the hands of cartels, again, when you just read about the incredible violence happening down there, very, very, very concerning. And myself and other ATF agents who spoke up about the problems have now been subject to some interesting actions by the Department of Justice. I'll say the difference that I have compared to some of the other whistleblowers that I've spoken to and who I've met here is that the ATF command staff, other than those who were involved in these actions, have actually been quite supportive to me and of my actions. It's others within the Department of Justice who have lashed out. And ironically, the bad acts only revolve around a small number of prosecutors in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Arizona who would be very easy to hold them accountable. But I guess it's a lot easier to get rid of a couple special agents than a couple DOJ attorneys. I want to thank you for being here today. Again, I'm not as articulate as our previous speakers, and forgive my thick New York accent. What I will say is, you know, we do need better whistleblower protection laws here in the United States. What I did was something that I felt compelled to do by that oath to the U.S. Constitution that, as I said earlier, I took 3 times. But without better protection, I would say the lesson to be learned today would be don't be Pete Forcelli, don't be Colonel Schaffer, don't step up and do the right thing if you have a family to feed, if you have mouths to feed, if you have a mortgage to pay, unless we can get better protection in place to keep people safe and encourage people to step forward and do the truth. So I thank you for your time.
I was hired 23 years ago for National Taxpayers Union. They made the mistake of taking a look at my resume and saying this guy could probably answer phones competently, and they made me the receptionist. Well, one of the first calls I took, my first day on the job, was someone whose voice I could barely hear. I told the man, please speak up, speak up. He said he really couldn't, and I understood why. He was sobbing. He could barely get the words out. He was telling me, I just can't do this anymore. I've talked to as many people as I can at the Internal Revenue Service. I can't get this tax problem resolved. I have no choice but to kill myself today. I was 23 years old. I was not prepared for this. When I was hired at NTU, I thought I'd be dealing with distributional tables of tax burdens, plowing through budgets. I never thought I'd have to be a counselor my first day on the job. But it was then that I began to appreciate the human dimension of fiscal policy and of the workings of government. And I thought to myself, as I kept reviewing all of these horror stories of people on the outside who had experienced bureaucratic abuse from the Internal Revenue Service or others, what about the people on the inside? And then I began to get a history lesson myself. Some of you may know that National Taxpayers Union was co-founded by a fellow named Ernie Fitzgerald, who was regarded as one of the first world-class whistleblowers. In fact, when I was on my third day on the job, I was told to start plowing through our newsletters. Ernie had retired from active leadership in my outfit by the time I was there, so I had to just read about it. Here's one of the examples from way back in 1980. Is this any way to run an Air Force? You can tell this was the thing that Ernie blew the whistle on, the C5A project. Knowing falsification on behalf of the Air Force, the Pentagon, and Lockheed at the time, they deliberately underbid the project, and hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars were going to be wasted. All the parties involved knew this, so did Ernie. He said it's time to tell taxpayers the truth, and he had just a years-long battle trying to restore his professional reputation. I then realized that there are common elements between people who experience problems with government on the outside and those on the inside, the biggest one being the simple question that both whistleblowers and taxpayers ask of folks like me: why won't somebody listen? And those are the kinds of experiences that have informed my involvement with the whistleblower issue on behalf of National Taxpayers Union. We recognized in our battle, for example, on behalf of IRS reform legislation, that there were civil liberties issues at stake here, ones that could involve all kinds of organizations all across the political spectrum. So, 1988, my first year there, we organized a coalition involving groups like American Civil Liberties Union, National Council of La Raza, civil rights organizations who understood that a tax agency that is allowed to act with more powers than even the FBI at that time to conduct espionage on citizens, to conduct investigations that were well out of bounds of proper police procedures, that was a problem for all Americans. And so we were successful with that coalition in passing the first Taxpayers' Bill of Rights legislation. We thought everything's going to be fine, everyone's going to behave, we can all wave the flag, pay our taxes, and not fear abuses of power. Well, it didn't work out that way, obviously. Bringing folks who had had problems with the IRS to Congress, delivering that testimony to lawmakers, only went so far because we were not hearing from people on the inside. It took us the better part of 10 years, actually about 8 hearings that began in 1997, 98, from IRS employees who were willing to come forward and demonstrate that it's not just a matter of passing legislation with a bunch of procedures in it that agents are to follow. You have to look at the agency's culture itself and put steps in place that will change that culture for the better. We could never have learned that without the input of whistleblowers on the inside. The result was the IRS Restructuring and Reform Act. That has its critics from some federal employees, but I think the collaborative process between whistleblowers, taxpayers, and members of Congress gave us a piece of legislation that has fundamentally transformed an agency, helped to restore a balance between respect for citizens' rights and the need to collect revenue expeditiously. That's a model of success, I think, that can work throughout government and ought to be workable today. That's why, between this history that I learned, between our work on the IRS Restructuring and Reform Act, when Tom Devine came to me in the early 2000s saying, hey, would you like to join our coalition on behalf of restoring whistleblower rights, I said, sure. Every conservative ought to be in favor of that. I soon got a lesson that every conservative regarded some of these things rather skeptically. We were a voice in the wilderness at the time. Still, we found allies throughout the ideological community on our side, people who had understood the invaluable information that whistleblowers provide, regardless of who's in power, serves taxpayers. And as disillusionment with the Bush administration's fiscal policies grew, so did support among fiscal conservatives for some kind of remedy. Still, unfortunately, any fundamental reform that's worth its salt will have bipartisan opposition. That's the way it is. And we need to recognize the fact that this legislation will not pass without significant support from both parties, including self-professed fiscal conservatives who've recently been elected to Congress on the so-called Tea Party platform. Without that kind of support, we're going to have constant roadblocks put up in front of us legislatively. There will always be one last excuse keeping this legislation from getting over the hump. That means people on my side of the political spectrum have to do some heavy lifting here, and the heavy lifting is starting today. We have managed to get together a coalition of 15 conservative and libertarian organizations, national level, some of the most influential ones on the scene, including one from my colleague here, Dave Williams. We've signed a letter, an open letter to members of Congress demanding passage of S743 for fiscally conservative reasons. I'm going to leave a stack of these out on one of the tables. Please take them with you. Give them to every Republican member of Congress, especially, who thinks that this is not a taxpayer protection issue. They need to be convinced otherwise. Give this to every Democratic member of Congress, too, and tell them you now have allies in this fight. It's been far too long in passing this legislation. I cannot think of another issue that should be as uncontroversial, that has taken so long to get on the public agenda and move through the legislative process. We're committed to getting this passed in the 112th Congress. We're proud to be your allies. Come to us if you need help. That's what we're here for. Thank you.
Okay, Pete, 23 years ago you started? You were 23 at the time?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to thank Michael for inviting me to this panel. This is something that's very near and dear to my heart, whistleblowers and whistleblower protection. I started in DC 18 years ago, and I was putting together a document called Risky Business. It was looking at different agencies and how they could improve the function of the agencies. So I started making random phone calls, this one to the Department of Commerce. And I went through the big federal yellow book just looking for names. I picked a name out. And it was this gentleman. I called him. I told him where I was calling from, what I was researching. He's like, oh, I'm so glad you called. There are so many things in the Department of Commerce that we could do better. And he's like, oh, tell me, please, let me, he's like, well, I'm a little concerned because it's kind of frowned upon to give out a lot of this inside information. I have audits I want to share with you. They're not public yet, but I think you'll find them really interesting in putting together this document. Well, over a course of about 7 or 8 years, we actually became friends, and he gave me a lot of information, and he rose up through the ranks of Department of Commerce, and he actually made it into the Inspector General's office. And all of this time, he was funneling me information on how to improve how government runs. It's almost simultaneously, I get a phone call from a gentleman in Michigan who is a social worker, and he works with the Supplemental Security Income Program. Now, this was 1994, I believe, and at the time, SSI was giving cash to drug addicts and alcoholics. Just a check. If you're a drug addict or alcoholic, you can get a check. So what you do, well, you're supposed to use it for rehab, for housing, for food, and we all know that drug addicts will do that. They'll take cash and go to the nearest rehab center. But seriously, what would happen is they would go into a bar, they would cash their check, and then they would spend the check in that bar. So this gentleman called. He didn't give me his name. I didn't want his name, to be quite honest, and I think this was before email was readily available, so I had to wait about a week before I got the regular mail to come in so he could send me the documentation. It was absolutely fascinating what was happening. And he had addressed this to his superiors, and no one was paying attention to it, saying, well, this is the way it's done, this is the way it's always going to be done. So there was, this bureaucratic malaise. So what we did was, we did a half-hour documentary on government waste, and we did a 6-minute segment on this particular story, on supplemental security income, giving cash to drug addicts and alcoholics. I went out to Denver to see firsthand how this works. So I wanted to, you can read about it in the paper, you can hear the stories, but until you actually witness it, it doesn't, really ring true. So I went to Denver, and there was a gentleman, Bob Cote, who ran this. He didn't call it a halfway house. It was step 13. It was a hand up, not a hand out. And what he did was he had witnessed this a lot. The money being used for alcohol and drugs. So he took me around Denver, and it was the first of the month. So the checks had just come out, and we were taking a break from filming, and we were outside of his place, and we see this guy down on his luck walk into a bar, and he said, "You see that guy over there? He has an SSI check in his pocket. I know him." So we waited around. About 3 hours later, he stumbles out of the bar, falls in the road, cracks his head open. The ambulance has to come, has to pick him up and take him to the hospital. I had literally watched someone walk into a bar with a government check, cash it, and then drink it. And now he comes out and has to be rushed to the hospital. Needless to say, that was 1994. I had been in the city for a year. Needless to say, that had a very profound effect on me and what government waste meant to me and what making the government more efficient meant to me. The good news is, after some intense lobbying, we got the law changed, that no longer cash was given to drug addicts and alcoholics. They had to use it for rehab and for housing. So that was quite a moment in my life, and I never have really thought about whistleblowing being conservative or liberal until Michael sent me an email about 3 weeks ago. I thought that everybody wanted good government and wanted a more efficient government. And when you're talking about the Fast and Furious program, Darrell Issa is all over this. I mean, he's genuinely concerned. So what's the next step for Darrell Issa? Is it to pass more whistleblower protection? That's what I think should be the lesson in this, is that it's important to understand the value of whistleblowers. I've had Department of Defense whistleblowers call me. Earmarks, we all know about the Bridge to Nowhere and the indoor rainforest in Iowa. But received a phone call probably about 7 years ago. This gentleman who never told me his name, even set up a fake email account. He called himself Ishmael. He said, "Call me Ishmael," which I thought was funny. And he had served in Iraq, and there was some anti-IED technology that they were using that wasn't working. And he said the reason is that a certain member of Congress, and I actually forget who it was, but had been earmarking money to send back to his district, to this one particular contractor, just so they could get the contract. There was no metrics as to whether or not this program worked. It was just a result of earmarking. Now, the Republicans have been on the bandwagon against earmarks. So there are a lot of connections here for why conservatives, I guess I shouldn't say conservatives and Republicans in the same sentence. But the past 18 years have shown me, and I just want to thank Pete for his leadership in putting this letter together. And I don't know why there aren't 50 conservative organizations on this. And I really don't understand the hesitation. I do know that working in this field for 18 years that no matter who calls me, because someone said, well, there are a lot of crazy people out there that will call you and tell you these weird stories. I'm like, but they're calling me. I will take 40 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. If they have a story to tell, I will listen to their story, because who knows when the next SSI, when the next Department of Commerce person is going to come forward. And I really think it's important for people to feel that they have protections from both sides of the aisle in this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Due to time constraints, we're going to wind this down, but hopefully everyone can be available for conversations afterwards. And I'd like to encourage you all to take Pete up on his offer for all of us to participate with you all in supporting whistleblower protections. Super committee.
Definitely stress to your lawmakers, this is something that the super committee needs to put front and center for whatever passes or whatever doesn't pass. It should be part of their agenda. It undergirds everything else dealing with federal spending. So it's an important point.
And I'd also like to encourage everyone to pick up the conservative letter in support of whistleblower protections. And thank you very much.